In the dark and freezing days of December 1940, the future of Western civilization hung by a single fraying thread. With every passing hour, that thread grew weaker. The Battle of Britain had been won in the skies, and the Royal Air Force had broken the Luftwaffe's attempt to gain control of the air. But victory above the clouds did not bring peace on the ground. The Blitz was still raging. Night after night, German bombers crossed the Channel and turned British cities into infernos. London burned. Coventry burned. Liverpool burned. The industrial heartlands that powered the British war effort were pounded relentlessly, and civilians slept in underground stations, unsure if their homes would still be standing by morning. On the world map, the British Empire still appeared vast and powerful, a great splash of imperial pink covering nearly a quarter of the globe. From Canada to India, from Africa to Australia, Britain still seemed to rule the seas. But inside the underground war rooms of Whitehall, the men who ran the British government knew a truth so dangerous they dared not speak it aloud. The empire was not only bleeding soldiers. It was bleeding to death financially. The war was consuming money at a pace no empire in history had ever survived before. Deep beneath London, in the reinforced chambers of the cabinet war rooms, Winston Churchill sat at his desk to write one of the most important letters of his life. Churchill was a master of language, a man whose words could harden resolve and rally nations. But this letter was different. This time he could not inspire or defy. He had to perform a humiliating balancing act. The letter was addressed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, the leader of the world's richest nation and, officially, a neutral one. Churchill carefully described the strategic situation, the growing U-boat threat in the Atlantic, and Britain's desperate need for destroyers and aircraft. Then came the admission hidden beneath the diplomacy. Britain was running out of money. The moment was approaching when the British Treasury would no longer be able to pay cash for the supplies required to survive. The British people would fight on the beaches and in the streets, he wrote, but they could not fight without ammunition, and they could no longer afford to buy it. It was a plea for survival. It was an admission of insolvency. To understand how the wealthiest empire in history reached this point, it is necessary to understand the ruthless economics of total war. When the war began in September 1939, Britain was still a financial giant. It held billions of dollars in gold reserves and owned vast overseas investments. British citizens controlled railroads in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, and major industrial firms in the United States. The City of London was the center of global finance, insurance, and shipping. On paper, Britain was rich. This was a war of machines. It devoured steel, oil, aluminum, rubber, and fuel at a rate that shattered every pre-war assumption. And Britain faced one fatal weakness. It had to import almost everything it needed to fight. The continent was closed, and the Atlantic became a deadly battlefield patrolled by German submarines. Britain had only one source left for survival: the United States. But America in 1940 was officially neutral and deeply isolationist. The memory of the First World War still haunted the American public, and Congress had passed a series of neutrality acts designed to keep the nation out of foreign conflicts. At the heart of these laws was a single brutal rule known as cash and carry. Britain could buy American weapons and supplies, but only if it paid in cash, paid immediately, and transported the goods on its own ships. There would be no loans and no credit. The United States was willing to sell the tools of war, but only in exchange for gold on the barrelhead. For the first year of the conflict, Britain complied. It drained its treasury to meet American demands. Gold reserves were liquidated and overseas assets were converted into dollars. In a secret operation known as Operation Fish, the British government loaded the nation's remaining gold and financial securities onto warships and fast liners and shipped them across the submarine-infested Atlantic to safety in Canada. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in human history. Billions of dollars in gold bars and negotiable assets were sent into exile, not to build prosperity, but simply to pay for survival. By late 1940, the gold was gone. The cash was gone. In Washington, the British Purchasing Commission, responsible for buying planes, tanks, and weapons, faced an impossible situation. Contracts lay unsigned on desks because officials in London had delivered a devastating message. There were no dollars left to honor them. When Roosevelt received Churchill's letter, he immediately understood what was at stake. If Britain fell, the United States would eventually face Nazi Germany alone. But Roosevelt also understood the political trap he was in. He could not openly give Britain money. American law forbade it, and public opinion would not tolerate it. He needed a way to save Britain that looked like a hard-headed business deal rather than an act of charity. From that dilemma, an idea began to form that would reshape the global balance of power and permanently alter the financial architecture of the modern world. Out of that political dilemma in Washington was born one of the most consequential financial arrangements in history. Roosevelt needed a way to help Britain without openly violating American law or inflaming isolationist opinion. He needed to frame survival as commerce. The solution became known as Lend-Lease. When Roosevelt introduced the idea to the public, he used a simple, almost folksy analogy. If your neighbor's house is on fire, he explained, you don't haggle over the price of a garden hose. You lend him the hose, and when the fire's out, he gives it back. The story sounded generous, even moral. It reassured Americans that they were not being dragged into war, only helping a neighbor in need. Behind closed doors, the reality was far colder. This was not a friendly exchange between equals. It was a foreclosure process conducted by the world's most powerful creditor. The man overseeing the negotiations was Henry Morgenthau Jr., the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. His position was ruthless and clear. Before the United States provided a single dollar of aid, Britain had to prove it had exhausted every asset it owned. Morgenthau demanded a full financial audit of the British Empire. He wanted a complete accounting of every government asset and every privately held British investment anywhere in the world. Nothing was to be hidden. Nothing was to be spared. The British negotiators, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, were stunned. They were being asked to open their books to a foreign power while fighting for survival. They explained that Britain had already sold off its gold reserves. They warned that dumping long-term overseas investments during a war would amount to a fire sale, destroying Britain's post-war future. Selling income-producing assets, they argued, would leave the country unable to feed its population or rebuild its cities once peace returned. Morgenthau was unmoved. His instructions were firm. Britain would receive aid only after it had scraped the bottom of the barrel. The most painful symbol of this forced liquidation was the case of American Viscose Corporation. American Viscose was not a minor holding. It was one of the largest industrial companies in the United States, the dominant producer of rayon and artificial silk. It was enormously profitable and generated millions of dollars in dividends that flowed back to Britain every year, helping offset Britain's chronic trade deficit. The company was owned by Courtaulds, a British firm, and represented one of the crown jewels of Britain's overseas wealth. Morgenthau singled it out. He told the British negotiators that American Viscose had to be sold. The cash from the sale would be deposited directly into the U.S. Treasury to pay for existing weapons orders. The British resisted fiercely. They knew the company was worth well over $100 million. Selling it quickly under political pressure during wartime would be financial suicide. But Morgenthau held the leverage. The Lend-Lease bill was moving through Congress, and isolationists were attacking it, claiming Britain was secretly wealthy and trying to trick America into paying its bills. Morgenthau needed proof that Britain was bleeding. He needed a public sacrifice. He issued an ultimatum: sell American Viscose, or Lend-Lease would die in committee. Under immense pressure, the British government capitulated. On March 10, 1941, using emergency wartime powers, the British state seized American Viscose from its owners through a compulsory purchase order. The sale was handled by American investment bankers who knew Britain had no choice. Because it was a distressed sale, the price was mercilessly driven down. The company was sold for roughly $54 million, barely half of its true value. It was, in effect, legalized theft. The British government reimbursed Courtaulds in pounds back in London, increasing its internal debt, while the dollars from the sale went straight into the U.S. Treasury to pay for rifles, aircraft engines, and ammunition. The sale of American Viscose was a turning point. It was the moment Britain's elite understood the real price of the so-called special relationship. Britain was not being treated as an equal ally. It was being treated as a bankrupt client whose assets were being stripped to fund its own survival. The United States was absorbing the wealth of the British Empire not through conquest, but through contracts and leverage. The empire was being dismantled quietly, transaction by transaction, under the pressure of war. And this liquidation did not stop with factories and companies. It extended into the very foundations of Britain's global power. As financial negotiations dragged on, another deal was struck involving the Royal Navy. Britain was desperate for destroyers. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than British shipyards could replace them. The Atlantic lifeline was being severed. Churchill begged Roosevelt for 50 old American destroyers, World War I-era ships rusting in U.S. naval yards. Roosevelt agreed, but once again, there would be no gift. In exchange for those 50 obsolete ships, the United States demanded 99-year leases on a chain of British naval and air bases stretching from Newfoundland to the Caribbean, including the Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, and British Guiana. The scale of the trade was staggering. Britain handed the United States a strategic military footprint across the entire Western Hemisphere. It gave Washington control over bases that would project American power for generations. In return, Britain received ships that were barely seaworthy. It was a geopolitical fire sale, the act of a desperate nation trading its long-term security for short-term survival. Britain was pawning the empire itself to stay alive. By the time the Lend-Lease Act was finally signed into law in March 1941, Britain had already been stripped nearly bare. The gold reserves were gone. Overseas investments were being sold at distressed prices. Strategic military bases had been leased away for nearly a century. Publicly, Lend-Lease was celebrated as an act of generosity, the moment America became the arsenal of democracy. And in practical terms, it did keep Britain alive. The tanks, aircraft, fuel, food, and raw materials flowing across the Atlantic prevented the British Isles from being starved into submission by German submarines. Without Lend-Lease, Britain would almost certainly have lost the war. But beneath the rhetoric of solidarity lay financial terms that quietly reshaped the post-war world. Hidden deep within the Lend-Lease agreement was a clause known as Article 7. Written in dense diplomatic language, it appeared harmless at first glance. In reality, it was a financial poison pill for the British Empire. Article 7 required Britain, in return for American aid, to dismantle its system of imperial preference after the war. Imperial preference was the economic glue that held the empire together. It was a network of tariffs and trade rules that favored commerce between Britain and its colonies. British goods entered empire markets at lower prices than foreign goods, especially American ones. This system allowed British industry to survive despite being less efficient than its American counterpart. By agreeing to Article 7, Britain was committing to tear down its own economic defenses. The British negotiators understood exactly what this meant. Opening imperial markets to American exporters would expose British manufacturers to overwhelming competition. American factories were larger, newer, and far more productive. They could undercut British prices almost anywhere in the world. The negotiators protested. They warned that dismantling imperial preference would destroy Britain as post-war recovery and dissolve the empire as an economic unit. But they had no leverage left. German bombers still attacked British cities. U-boats still prowled the Atlantic. The treasury was empty. Britain signed. As the war expanded and the United States officially entered the conflict after Pearl Harbor, the military relationship between the two nations deepened. American soldiers poured into Britain. Airfields, ports, and roads were transformed to support U.S. forces. Britain became a vast aircraft carrier from which American bombers would strike occupied Europe. But economically, the imbalance only grew. American industry exploded under the weight of government spending. Factories multiplied, productivity soared, and the U.S. economy expanded at a pace never before seen in history. Britain's economy, by contrast, was being hollowed out. Civilian production stopped. Exports collapsed. Entire industries were converted exclusively to war production. While British factories produced Spitfires and tanks, American factories produced Spitfires, tanks, refrigerators, radios, cars, and consumer goods for global markets. Britain abandoned its commercial presence in Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia because it could not spare the resources to compete. American companies stepped into the vacuum. By the time the war entered its final years, the transfer of economic dominance was complete. The world's gold reserves had moved from London to Fort Knox. The financial center of gravity had shifted permanently across the Atlantic. Despite this, British leaders believed that their sacrifice would be recognized after the war. They assumed that Lend-Lease would continue for a transition period. They believed the United States would help them rebuild and stabilize their shattered economy. After all, Britain had fought alone against Hitler for 2 years while America remained neutral. Britain had spent its wealth, its empire, and its future to hold the line. Surely that would count for something. But they had misunderstood the nature of power. In high finance, gratitude is not a currency. On August 15, 1945, news of Japan's surrender flashed around the world. World War II was over. In London, crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, lighting bonfires and singing in the streets. Strangers embraced. The nightmare was finished. But in Washington, there was no celebration. Only paperwork. 7 days later, President Harry Truman signed an order that struck Britain harder than any Luftwaffe bombing raid. Lend-Lease was terminated. The cutoff was immediate and absolute. There would be no transition, no grace period. American ships loaded with food, fuel, and raw materials were ordered to turn around mid-Atlantic and return home. The British government was stunned. Their entire economy was still organized around wartime supply chains funded by Lend-Lease dollars. Without them, Britain was bankrupt instantly. Not in months. Not in years. Immediately. The legendary economist John Maynard Keynes examined the figures and saw disaster. Britain imported roughly half its food and almost all of its raw materials. Without American dollars, those imports would stop. Rations, already severe, would be cut to starvation levels. Factories would shut down. Unemployment would explode. Keynes described the situation as a financial Dunkirk. Retreat or collapse were the only options. There was only one path left. Britain had to beg again. In September 1945, a sick and exhausted John Maynard Keynes boarded a ship bound for Washington. He was suffering from heart disease and would soon die, but he was the greatest economic mind of his generation. Keynes believed Britain had a moral claim. He intended to argue that Britain had fought the war for 2 years alone, sacrificing its economy to save Western civilization. The United States, he believed, should provide a grant, not a loan, a retroactive payment for blood and treasure already spent. He called it justice. Washington had a different view. When John Maynard Keynes arrived in Washington, he quickly realized that the moral argument he carried with him had no value in the new world taking shape. The war was over. American factories were shifting back to civilian production. Congress was focused inward, tired of funding Europe and deeply suspicious of Britain's newly elected Labour government, which openly spoke of socialism and nationalization. To many in Washington, Britain was no longer a heroic ally but a potential economic liability. The men across the table from Keynes were not sentimental. They were accountants, bankers, and officials who understood leverage. They informed him bluntly that there would be no gift, no grant, and no retroactive payment. There would only be a loan, and it would be issued on commercial terms, with interest. Keynes was devastated. He warned that crushing Britain financially would weaken the entire Western alliance at the very moment a new threat was emerging in the form of the Soviet Union. He argued that Britain's collapse would destabilize Europe and invite chaos. The Americans listened, but they did not bend. They knew Britain had no alternative. With food imports at risk and reserves exhausted, Britain was negotiating from a position of absolute weakness. The offer placed on the table was a loan of $3.75 billion, just enough to prevent immediate starvation. But the money came with conditions designed not to help Britain recover, but to permanently reshape the global economic order. The most dangerous of these conditions was sterling convertibility. Under the terms of the loan, Britain was required to make the pound sterling fully convertible into US dollars within 1 year. On the surface, this was presented as a move toward free trade and financial openness. In reality, it was a carefully aimed weapon. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies and trading partners to accept payment in pounds, while forbidding them from converting those pounds into dollars. This created the sterling area, a closed financial loop that protected British industry by forcing imperial markets to buy British goods. The Americans wanted to break that system. Keynes immediately recognized the danger. He knew that once the pound became convertible, every country holding sterling would rush to exchange it for dollars. American goods were superior, cheaper, and more desirable. American factories were modern and efficient, while British industry had been worn down by years of war. Convertibility would trigger a run on the pound, draining Britain's dollar reserves in weeks. Keynes fought desperately to remove the clause, but his health deteriorated under the strain. The choice Britain faced was stark: accept the loan and risk financial collapse, or refuse it and face immediate starvation. Parliament voted to accept. Many describe the decision as a financial Munich, an act of appeasement carried out under duress. The loan agreement was signed in July 1946. Keynes returned to Britain broken and exhausted. A few months later, he died, his heart giving out after years spent trying to save his country from forces far larger than himself, but the worst was yet to come. The winter of 1947 was one of the coldest on record. Snow buried coal stockpiles. Power stations shut down. Factories closed. Millions of people sat in unheated homes, lighting candles because electricity had failed. This was not wartime Britain. This was victory. Food shortages intensified. Bread, which had never been rationed even during the height of the U-boat blockade, was rationed in peacetime. Living standards fell sharply. Then the clock struck on the American condition. On July 15, 1947, Britain made the pound fully convertible. What followed was exactly what Keynes had predicted. Within days, foreign governments and investors rushed to sell sterling and buy dollars. The reserves bled out at terrifying speed. Hundreds of millions of dollars vanished in weeks. The loan, intended to last years, began evaporating almost instantly. The situation became so dire that after just 5 weeks, on August 20, 1947, the British government slammed the window shut and suspended convertibility. The experiment had failed catastrophically. Britain had burned through a massive portion of the American loan for nothing. The humiliation was complete. The country had played by American rules and been crushed. The illusion of financial independence was gone. This weakness had immediate geopolitical consequences. In February 1947, Britain sent a confidential telegram to the U.S. State Department. For decades, Britain had acted as the guardian of Greece and Turkey, containing Soviet influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, the message was simple and stark. Britain could no longer afford it. The money was gone. The soldiers would be withdrawn. If the United States wanted to stop the spread of communism, it would have to take over. That telegram triggered the Truman Doctrine. Power had formally passed from London to Washington. Britain's decline continued. In 1949, with reserves once again dangerously low, the government was forced to devalue the pound. Before the war, £1 had been worth $4.86. It was cut to $2.80. Overnight, Britain became roughly 30% poorer relative to the rest of the world. Imports became more expensive. Living standards fell again. It was an admission that Britain was no longer economically competitive on a global scale. But the true cost of victory stretched far beyond the 1940s. The financial reckoning Britain faced after the war was not a short-term crisis. It was a burden that stretched across generations. The Anglo-American Loan of 1946, taken to prevent immediate starvation and economic collapse, was not a gift. It was a commercial debt with interest. Year after year, regardless of boom or recession, the British Treasury sent payments across the Atlantic. Through the optimism of the 1950s, the stagnation of the 1970s, the reforms of the Thatcher era, and the globalization of the 1990s, the debt remained. The final payment was not made until December 29, 2006. 60 years after the guns fell silent, British taxpayers were still paying for the privilege of having survived the Second World War. This reality shatters the comforting idea that wars produce clear winners. In the age of total war, victory comes at a cost that can cripple even the strongest nations. Germany lost the war and was physically destroyed. Britain won the war but was financially broken. Its cities survived, its flag still flew, and its moral authority was immense, but its economic power was gone. The only true winner of the conflict was the United States. American industrial output doubled during the war. Its factories were untouched by bombing. It emerged holding roughly 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. Through Lend-Lease, post-war loans, and the dismantling of imperial trade barriers, the United States opened global markets to its own products and secured its position at the center of the world economy. The British Empire was not dismantled by invading armies. It was dismantled by balance sheets. Its assets, its overseas investments, and its strategic bases were transferred not by conquest, but by contracts signed under pressure. The empire did not collapse overnight. It was quietly sold off, piece by piece, in a prolonged distressed sale managed by financial necessity and American leverage. What emerged in its place was a new global order dominated by the dollar, American industry, and American power. For the British people, The legacy of this transformation was a deep psychological scar. A lingering sense of decline settled into the national consciousness. The idea of the special relationship with the United States became a polite euphemism for dependence. Britain remained an important ally, but it was no longer the architect of global affairs. It had become a junior partner in a world it once ruled. When Winston Churchill wrote his letter to Roosevelt in December 1940, he saved his country from Hitler. Without American support, Britain would likely have been starved into submission. But that letter also marked the moment Britain traded its empire for survival. There was no alternative. The deal had to be made. The price, however, was permanent. Britain spent its past to secure its present, and in doing so, it sold its future to its ally. In August 1945, crowds outside Buckingham Palace celebrated victory with pure, unfiltered joy. Bonfires burned, strangers embraced, and the long nightmare ended. The British Empire had stood alone against the darkness and prevailed, yet victory concealed a deeper loss. Britain emerged from the war as a moral giant, but an economic pygmy. It had sacrificed its wealth, its empire, and its global dominance to defend freedom in Europe. The story of Britain's wartime finances is not a tale of betrayal or villainy. It is a story about power, leverage, and the cold logic of money. Nations, like individuals, are judged not by their intentions but by their balance sheets. Britain did the right thing. It fought when others hesitated. It paid the price in full. The empire did not fall. It was sold. Sold piece by piece to pay the bill for doing the right thing. This is the history behind money.